The morning they escorted her out of Meridian Cross Hospital with a cardboard box and a security badge already deactivated, nobody said a word in her defense. Not one person. 41 nurses on that floor, 9 attending physicians, and a department director who wouldn't make eye contact, and every single one of them watched Mara Voss walk to the elevator alone. They thought she was just another ER nurse who'd gotten too loud, too confident, too much trouble to keep around. They were wrong. Because 3 hours later, when the wounded started arriving, the hospital discovered the woman they'd thrown away was the only one who could stop the dying. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel right now so you never miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The cardboard box wasn't heavy. That was the part that stayed with Mara Voss the longest. Not the humiliation of being walked out by a security guard named Pitts, who kept his eyes on the floor and his mouth shut the whole way. Not the quiet that fell over the ER nursing station when Director Holloway handed her the termination letter in front of everyone. Not even the particular expression on Dr. Garrett Solin's face when it happened. That careful, practiced blankness that was somehow worse than a smirk. No, it was the weight of the box, or the lack of it. 7 years at Meridian Cross Hospital, 7 years of 12-hour shifts and missed holidays and nights she'd driven home so tired she'd pulled over twice on the interstate because her eyes stopped working right. And all of it fit into a box she could carry with one hand. A coffee mug. A spare set of compression socks still in the wrapper. A photo of her brother taken at his Army graduation, which she'd kept taped to the inside of her locker since her first week. A handful of pens she'd been hoarding for 6 months, because Meridian Cross perpetually ran out of the kind that didn't bleed through paper. That was the sum of 7 years. She carried it to the elevator without looking back. The story of why it happened wasn't complicated, even if the people involved had done their best to complicate it. 3 days earlier, Mara had been in Trauma Bay 2 with a 58-year-old male, Raymond Okafor, brought in from a construction site after a fall from scaffolding on the 4th floor of a building going up on the east side of Dunmore, Pennsylvania. The paramedics had logged it as a left femur fracture with suspected concussion. Vital signs on arrival were rocky but not catastrophic. Dr. Solin had taken one look at the chart, ordered x-rays and a CT of the head, and moved on to the next bay. Mara had stayed. She didn't have a reason she could have written cleanly on a form. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in the hands and the gut before it ever made it to language. The way Okafor's color was wrong. Not gray wrong, but pale in a specific way she'd seen before. A particular quality of stillness in a person who should have been in more pain. His abdomen was slightly distended. His pressure was dipping in a pattern that didn't match the stated injuries. She found Dr. Solin at the nursing station. "I need you to come back and look at Okafor again." Solin didn't look up from the chart he was annotating. "He's imaging. I think he's bleeding internally. His pressure's trending down and his abdomen doesn't look right. He fell from scaffolding. He has a fractured femur and a head injury, Mara. Those are the injuries. I know what the paramedics logged. I'm telling you what I'm seeing in the room." That got him to look up. Dr. Garrett Solin was 44 years old, 8 years out of his fellowship at a hospital in Philadelphia that he mentioned in roughly 1 out of every 3 conversations, and he had a particular way of looking at nurses when they pushed back. Not angry, not dismissive exactly, more like a teacher encountering a student who'd gotten the wrong answer with the irritating confidence of someone who thought they'd gotten it right. "Mara," he set down his pen. "I've ordered the appropriate workup. When imaging comes back, we'll reassess." "That could take 40 minutes. If I'm right, he doesn't have 40 minutes. You're a nurse." The way he said it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I know what I am," she said. "Then let me do my job." He picked up the pen again. "Go back to your patient and monitor his vitals. That's what I need from you right now." She went back. She also pulled the ultrasound machine into the bay herself, which was technically within her scope, and did a focused abdominal assessment, which found free fluid in Morrison's pouch. Free fluid that, combined with his pressure trend and his mechanism of injury, meant one thing clearly enough that she went back to the nursing station and set it in front of 4 other people. "He has a splenic laceration. He needs a surgeon now." Solon stood up that time. What happened next took about 6 minutes. He came to the bay, looked at her ultrasound findings, page surgery, and by the time Okafor was in the OR 20 minutes later, his pressure had bottomed out twice, and the surgical team found a grade 3 splenic laceration actively bleeding. He survived. He was in the ICU by midnight, and none of that mattered at all. Because what the administration heard was that a floor nurse had overridden an attending physician's clinical judgment, performed an assessment outside her sanctioned protocol, and created a confrontational situation at the nursing station in front of staff and in proximity to other patients. The complaint came from Solon. Holloway called her in the next morning. Bosin. The meeting had lasted 22 minutes. Mara knew because she'd watched the clock on the wall behind Holloway's head the entire time, a habit she'd developed in situations where she needed to stay quiet, and the clock gave her something to do with her attention that wasn't looking at the person talking. Director Pamela Holloway was not a cruel woman. Mara had worked with her long enough to know that. She was a pragmatic one, which in hospital administration often produced the same outcomes as cruelty, but with better paperwork. She talked about institutional culture and professional hierarchy and the importance of trust between physicians and nursing staff, and she talked about it for most of those 22 minutes in the careful, regretful tone of someone who had already made the decision before she sat down. "This isn't about whether you were right," Holloway said near the end. "My patient is alive," Mara said. "I understand that. He wouldn't be if I'd waited for imaging." "Mara," Holloway folded her hands on the desk. "This hospital cannot function if nurses are second-guessing attending decisions in public spaces. That's not a judgment about your abilities. It's about structure. It's about how care gets delivered safely." "With respect," Mara said, and she meant it, even then. Structure doesn't save people. Attention does. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. "I'm sorry. The decision's been made." There was a severance packet. There was a form about COBRA coverage. There was Pitts with his eyes on the floor. And there was the box, which was not heavy. What? The parking garage was 4 levels, and she'd been on the 3rd floor for 7 years, because the 3rd floor had a stairwell exit that came out closer to the ER entrance, which had mattered on the morning she was running late. Old habit. She took the stairs down to her car now, a blue 2018 Civic with a dent in the rear bumper she'd been meaning to fix since February, set the box on the hood, and stood there. Dunmore, Pennsylvania in early November was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically. It just settled in, gray and steady, the kind that made you feel like winter had been there all along, and summer had been the interruption. The sky above the parking garage was the color of old concrete. She should call her brother. That was the first clear thought she had. Eli would want to know, and he'd say something useful, probably, or at least something real. He had a talent for that, not for making things better, but for not pretending they were fine when they weren't, which she'd always valued more. She had her phone out when she heard the first siren. Not a single ambulance, multiple vehicles, the kind of overlapping building sound that meant something had happened that was larger than a car accident and closer than it should be. She looked toward the garage entrance. A military transport vehicle, olive drab, boxy, not a Humvee, but one of the larger personnel carriers, came down the street faster than it should have been moving in a city environment, and behind it, a second one, and behind that, 2 black SUVs with government plates running with lights but no sirens, which was somehow more alarming than the sirens. They turned into the hospital's emergency bay. Mara didn't make a decision exactly. She put her phone in her pocket and moved. She was at the edge of the garage entrance when the first transport's rear doors opened and the situation became clear and terrible very quickly. There were soldiers inside. She counted 8 before the second transport pulled up and she stopped counting. And several of them were not moving under their own power. There was a medic in the back working on someone and calling out information to nobody in particular because there was nobody there yet to receive it. The ER entrance doors slid open and 3 nurses came out, followed by Solon, who had clearly been flagged by someone inside. He stopped at the edge of the bay and looked at the 2 transports and the SUVs and the soldiers being helped or carried out. And for just a moment his face showed exactly what it was. Overwhelmed. Mara recognized the math immediately. She'd done it before in different circumstances, with different equipment and no hospital behind her at all. Just a casualty collection point in a field and a bag of supplies, and the requirement to sort who needed what in what order. 8 from the first transport she'd counted. The second was still unloading. The medic from the first vehicle, young, maybe 23, blood on his uniform that wasn't all his own, had gotten out and was trying to relay information to the ER nurses while also watching back over his shoulder at the patients behind him. Mara crossed the bay without thinking about the box on the hood of her car. "What happened?" she said to the medic. He looked at her, clocked her scrubs. She was still in her scrubs, had been wearing them when they walked her out, and answered because she'd asked with the right tone at the right moment. "Training accident, demolition exercise. Primary blast injury to 9 soldiers, shrapnel secondary to 4 of those. 1 crush injury, 2 possible TBEs. We've got 1 I'm worried about. He's been in and out since the transport. BP was 80 over 50 15 minutes ago." "Which one?" He pointed. "Third one out of the second transport, being supported between 2 soldiers who were themselves walking wounded." She moved toward them. "Hey," Solon's voice from behind her. "Hey, Mara." She didn't stop. The soldier being half-carried was young, maybe 21, and the color of his face told her what she needed to know before she touched him. She put 2 fingers on his wrist, while the soldiers holding him looked at her with the particular expression of people who need someone to take charge and will accept whoever steps into that role first. Pulse. Weak. Fast. Irregular enough to mean something. "What's his name?" she asked the soldier on the left. "Dubrow. Private First Class Dubrow." "Dubrow." She put a hand on his face, got his eyes to track toward her. "I've got you. Can you tell me where you feel pain?" "Chest," he said. It came out thin. "Everywhere. Mostly chest. Primary blast injury with chest pain. Weak pulse. Hypotension on transport." She ran the differentials in the 3 seconds it took her to get his shirt untucked and her hand against his ribcage. The left side wasn't moving right. "Tension pneumo," she said to the medic, who had followed her over. "Left side. He needs a needle now." The medic hesitated, not from incompetence, from the fact that there was a physician 6 feet away. "She's right." The voice came from behind her, and it belonged to someone she didn't recognize. An older man in a suit, one of the black SUVs, standing just outside the cluster with the controlled stillness of someone used to watching emergencies without inserting themselves into the clinical space. He wasn't talking to the medic. He was talking to Solon. Solon didn't move fast enough. "I'll do it," the medic said, and he did. And when the needle went in and Dubrow's breathing changed, not fixed but better, the desperate quality dropping out of it, the older man in the suit looked at Mara with an expression she couldn't read and didn't have time to. What happened over the next 45 minutes was the kind of thing that didn't look heroic in the moment, because nobody in the middle of it has the bandwidth to perform. It looked like controlled disorder. It looked like a woman in scrubs who no longer worked at this hospital moving through a bay full of casualties and making calls that the staff around her followed because the calls were right and there wasn't time to debate credential. Mara sorted the wounded by what the noise was hiding. The loudest ones, a soldier with a through and through in his left shoulder, another with burns on his forearms, a third screaming about his knee. Those were the ones who had enough physiology to keep screaming. You noted them, you triaged them to secondary, you moved to the ones who weren't making noise. She found 2 more that way. One was a female soldier, mid-20s, sitting very still against the transport's rear wheel, not crying, not calling for help, just sitting. Mara crouched in front of her. The stillness was the tell. "I'm going to put my hand on your stomach," she said. "Tell me if it changes anything." The soldier, her name tape said Mwangi, looked at her steadily. "It's been hurting since the blast." "Here?" Mara pressed gently. Mwangi made a sound that wasn't a scream but was close to one. "Okay," Mara said. "Okay, you're going to come with me right now." She got Mwangi up and moving and found a nurse she recognized from the internal medicine floor who had come down to help and handed Mwangi off with instructions specific enough that there was no ambiguity. Abdominal tenderness with blast mechanism, possible hollow viscous injury, needs imaging now, and a surgeon on standby. Solon appeared at her shoulder. "Mara." His voice was different from how it had been in the meeting. Not softer, exactly. Tighter. "You can't be on this floor." "I know," she said, and moved to the next patient. He didn't follow her again. Bamnet. It was a soldier named Private Terrence Holt who changed everything, though he didn't mean to. He was ambulatory, one of the walking wounded, a laceration on his scalp that had bled impressively but wasn't serious. He was standing near the nursing station waiting for someone to clean and close it when he saw Mara directing a gurney toward Trauma Bay 1. He went absolutely still. The nurse next to him noticed. "You okay?" "That woman," Holt said. "What about her?" He pushed off the wall and moved toward Mara fast enough that the nurse called out after him. He got close enough that she couldn't miss him, and he said her name, but not her full name, her rank. "Sergeant Voss." The ER nursing station was not a quiet place under normal circumstances, and today it was anything but. And yet the name cut through. Mara turned. Holt was standing at parade rest, automatic, the way some habits bypass whatever crisis is happening around them. His scalp laceration was still bleeding, and he didn't seem to notice it. "I was in Kandahar in 2017, third rotation. You pulled 4 men out of a burning vehicle and kept them alive for 90 minutes until the medevac made it. One of them was my squad leader." The nursing station had gone quieter than it should have. "My squad leader," Holt said again, and his voice cracked on the second word, "has 3 kids now. You probably don't even remember." Mara looked at him for a moment. "I remember," she said quietly. "Sit down and let someone look at your head." He sat. But the people who'd heard it didn't go back to whatever they'd been doing before. That was the problem with a revelation, or the gift of one, depending on how you looked at it. It didn't unhappen. It sat in the room and changed the air pressure. Nurse Dominique Ferris, who had been at Meridian Cross for 11 years and had a talent for holding opinions she didn't express until she needed to, met Mara's eyes across the station. She didn't say anything, but she nodded once, in a way that meant she had understood something and filed it. The man in the suit found Mara at approximately the 40-minute mark, when the acute phase had shifted from chaos to the particular grim steadiness of a mass casualty event that has been stabilized enough to move from reaction to management. His name was Aldrin Farquhar, and he identified himself as a Department of Defense civilian liaison, without explaining what that meant in practice, which was fine because Mara had enough to do and didn't need the explanation. "The soldier you stabilized on arrival," he said. "Dubrow. The medic said you identified the tension pneumothorax before the needle decompression." "The medic identified it," Mara said, "because that was the truth. I just said it first. He said you saw it from 10 feet away, before you touched him. 10 years of ER nursing, and before that 4 years of practice where the imaging equipment was whatever you could carry." Farquhar looked at her. "You were a combat medic." 68 whiskey. I got out in 2014. "And you've been here since?" 2015. With 1 year off in between." He nodded slowly. It wasn't the nod of someone receiving new information. It was the nod of someone confirming something they'd already suspected. "Who made the call to let you work the floor just now?" "Nobody," she said. "I made the call." "You're not currently employed here." "No, I'm not. And you know that." "I do." He looked at her for another moment. Around them, the controlled disorder of the ER continued. Gurneys moving, voices calling out numbers and names, the particular rhythm of a department running at its limits but not past them. Yet. "Don't leave the hospital," Farquhar said. It wasn't a request, quite, but it wasn't a threat either. It was the tone of someone who needed a variable to stay stable while other things moved. "I wasn't planning to," Mara said. She turned back to the patient in front of her. Behind her, she heard Farquhar making a phone call. Not the content, just the tone. Calm, precise, the kind of call that gets made when someone needs to find out something quickly and already has the resources to find it. She didn't think about what he might be finding. There were still 11 soldiers whose status she hadn't personally confirmed, and 2 of them had been placed in the acute care bays without anyone giving her a clear update, and one of those 2 was Mwangi, whose stillness in the parking bay had meant something specific that she was not yet willing to stop worrying about. She moved toward the acute bays. She had the particular forward motion quality of someone who had learned a long time ago in conditions much worse than this, that the only way through a mass casualty event was through it. One patient, one decision, one step, the whole time, and you didn't stop until everyone who could be saved was saved, and the ones who couldn't be were not your fault. Her badge was deactivated. Her termination letter was in her cardboard box on the hood of a blue Civic on the third floor of the parking garage. The cold November air was still sitting on the city outside. None of that mattered yet. But in the main corridor behind the nursing station, Dr. Garrett Solon was on the phone with Director Holloway, and he was using the word liability repeatedly, and Director Holloway was listening, and Farquhar, who was still on his own phone 12 feet away, was also listening to Solon and writing something down. And in the secure office at the back of the hospital's administrative suite, a fax machine that still existed for exactly this kind of situation was starting to print something from a federal record system. The first page came through. It had a classification header at the top that had been partially redacted, and below that, a name. Voss, Mara J. And below the name, a list of citations, assignments, and incident reports that began in 2010 and did not end where anyone at Meridian Cross Hospital would have expected. The fax machine printed 17 pages. Farquhar collected them without urgency, the way a person handles documents they already know the shape of before reading, methodically, without the slight catch of surprise that normal people show when a stack of paper turns out to be longer than expected. He squared the pages against the edge of the machine, folded them once without reading them in the open hallway, and put them inside his jacket. Then he went to find Director Holloway. He found her in the corridor outside the nursing station, still on the phone with Solon or finishing the call, Shema. She was saying, "I understand your concern, Garrett, and I'll address it," in the tone that meant she was ending the conversation rather than agreeing with it. She clicked off when she saw Farquhar's face. "What is that?" she asked, looking at the fold in his jacket. "Background on your nurse." "She's not our nurse anymore. That's the issue. She's a terminated employee operating on Ms. Holloway." He said it quietly, without sharpness, and it stopped her. "I need 5 minutes of your time in a private space before you do anything else about Mara Voss." Holloway looked at him. She was not a woman who was easily managed, and something in the way he'd said the name, like it was a specific kind of weight, made her pause. "Conference room B," she said. "Give me 2 minutes." She gave him 4 because the floor was still moving fast, and she stopped twice to redirect nurses before she got there. But when she walked in and closed the door and he handed her the first 6 pages of the fax, she stopped moving entirely. She read standing up. She didn't sit down. Farquhar waited. "This is her?" Holloway finally said. "That's her." "This is the same woman who was escorted out of this building this morning?" "Yes." Holloway set the pages down on the conference table and looked at them without touching them, the way you look at something you need to think about before you decide how to handle it. "Why didn't we know this?" "Her service record is partially sealed. The sections relevant to your hiring process would have shown a 4-year enlistment and an honorable discharge. Nothing else would have been accessible without a specific clearance query." He paused. "She didn't volunteer it." "Why not?" Farquhar didn't answer that, because it wasn't his answer to give. Holloway picked the pages back up. She turned to page 4, which Farquhar had expected her to turn to, because page 4 was where the language changed from administrative record to incident summary, and the incident summaries were not written in the dry, passive voice of military bureaucracy. They were written by people who had been there. She read for a while. "What do you need from me?" she finally asked. "Right now, let her work," Walshabt. Mara didn't know about the facts. She didn't know about the conference room or the pages or the particular expression on Holloway's face when she read page 4. She was in Trauma Bay 3 with Specialist Kwame Asante, who had a shrapnel fragment lodged approximately 2 centimeters below his left clavicle that the initial assessment had logged as superficial, but that Mara was not prepared to call superficial until she'd looked at it herself. The fragment wasn't visible. That was the first problem. The entry wound was small and clean, the kind that looked minor and occasionally meant something entirely the opposite depending on trajectory and depth. "Does it hurt when you breathe in deep?" she asked. Asante made a face. He was trying not to. She could see the effort. the particular masculine stubbornness of a young soldier who has been trained to perform toughness and is now performing it for a nurse in what was functionally a civilian setting, which made it feel higher stakes somehow. A little. That's not an answer. Does it hurt or not? Yeah, he said. Yeah, it hurts. Scale. Like a 6. When did it start? It was more like a 4 before, when we were driving. So it was getting worse. She found Dr. Priya Tamboli, who was one of the ER attendings and had the particular competence of someone who was busy and knew it and wasn't going to waste words on anything that wasn't necessary. Mara pulled her aside and gave her the 30-second version. Tamboli looked at the entry wound, pressed 2 fingers gently to the surrounding tissue, and ordered a CT of the chest without discussion. Good catch, she said to Mara, already moving. It might be nothing. Might not be, Tamboli said over her shoulder. It was not nothing. The CT would show a fragment that had traveled farther than the entry wound suggested, sitting in a position that made the thoracic surgery fellow, who reviewed it quietly, glad they'd caught it when they did. But that was 40 minutes away yet, and Mara was already out of the bay. The nursing station had a controlled chaos to it that Mara was navigating partly by habit and partly by the particular economy of motion that comes from having done this in conditions where the wrong move cost you something you couldn't take back. She kept a mental map of the 18 patients currently in the ER, which was, under normal circumstances, well within the department's capacity, but normal circumstances didn't include 8 of them being blast injury casualties with overlapping time-sensitive complications. Dominique Ferris appeared at her side. Dominique was not, under normal circumstances, someone who appeared at your side. She had a permanent station at the nursing workstation and ran her section with the self-contained efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that her job was the patients in front of her and everything else was other people's problem. Bed 4 is asking for you, she said. Bed 4 has a physician. I know, she's asking for you anyway. Mara looked at her. It's Mwangi, Dominique said. Mara moved. Private First Class Adieze Mwangi was 26 years old, and she was scared, which she was managing by being extremely still and extremely controlled, which Mara recognized as a strategy she herself had used, and which was effective right up until it wasn't. The imaging had come back. A surgical resident named Bhat was in the bay reviewing it and trying to explain what it showed to Mwangi in language that was technically accurate and practically useless to someone who had no medical background and was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a blood pressure cuff cycling every 5 minutes. Mwangi's eyes went to Mara when she came through the curtain. Tell me what it actually means, she said. Bhat looked at Mara with an expression that was half irritated and half relieved. You have a small tear in your small intestine, Mara said, pulling a stool close. The blast pressure caused it. It's not big, but it's there, and it's leaking. How bad is that? Bad enough that they're going to fix it today. Not bad enough that you're going to die from it. She said the second part evenly because it needed to be said. You need surgery. That's what's happening next. Mwangi closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, opened them. Okay? Your blood pressure's been stable for the last 20 minutes. That's good. It means we caught it before it got out of hand. Because of you, in the parking lot. Because you sat still and let me get close. Mwangi made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I thought you were going to tell me it was nothing. That's usually what happens. Do I look like someone who tells people things are nothing when they're not? No, Mwangi admitted. No, you really don't. Bhat stepped out to call surgery and Mara stayed for another 90 seconds. Not because there was more medical information to convey, but because Mwangi's hand had moved slightly toward the edge of the bed rail in the way that meant she wanted to not be alone right now and wasn't going to ask for it. Mara put her hand over Mwangi's once, briefly, then stood. They're good, she said. The surgical team here is good. She left before Mwangi could say anything else because the rest of the floor was still moving and sentiment had a time and a place, and this was neither. The escalation came from a direction Mara hadn't tracked. She'd been aware of Solon the way you're aware of weather, peripherally, continuously, not as an active concern, but as an environmental condition. He was on the floor, he was treating patients, he was doing his job. That was fine. She wasn't interested in his awareness of her or her awareness of him beyond the functional minimum required to not collide in a corridor. But at the 50-minute mark, something shifted. She noticed it first through the nursing staff, the particular quiet that falls over a department when something administrative is happening that the clinical people aren't supposed to know about yet. Dominique went from present and efficient to present and very carefully not looking at anything specific, which in Mara's experience meant Dominique knew something and had decided to know it privately. Then she saw Holloway come back to the floor. Holloway had been absent for the middle portion of the past hour, which Mara had clocked and not thought about because absent administrators during a mass casualty event were generally preferable to present ones. But she was back now, and she was with Farker, and they were moving with the coordinated purpose of people who have agreed on something and are now enacting it. Solon intercepted them before they reached Mara. She couldn't hear the conversation. She was at the nurses' station reviewing a chart 20 feet away, and they were at the entrance to the corridor, and the noise of the department was between them. But she could read it, the angle of Solon's shoulders, the particular set of his head that she'd seen in the meeting when he'd said you're a nurse with that particular flatness. He was not pleased with whatever was being communicated to him. Farker said something short. Holloway added something. Solon said something longer. Farker responded with something shorter than what Solon had said, and Solon went quiet. Dominique appeared at Mara's shoulder. Dr. Solon filed a formal objection 20 minutes ago. Liability, exposure, unauthorized practice, chain of command. I know, Mara said. She had known he would. Not because Solon was a bad physician. She didn't think he was, not in the straightforward way, but because he was consistent. He did not do well with the shape of what had happened today, and filing a formal objection was the kind of response that was available to him, so he'd used it. Farquhar's been on the phone with someone at the DOD for the past half hour, Dominique continued. 3 calls. I wasn't listening, she added, with the tone of someone who absolutely had been listening in the ambient way that experienced nurses listen to everything on a floor without appearing to. What did he say? Couldn't make out specifics, but the 3rd call, he used the phrase expedited emergency credential review. I know what that means. Mara looked at her. It means they can grant temporary operating authority to a qualified individual in a declared emergency situation, Dominique said. Bypasses the normal hospital credentialing process. DOD has a provision for it in cases involving their personnel. That takes time. Under normal circumstances, yeah, but Farker has a fax machine's worth of documentation that apparently says you are not a normal circumstance. Dominique paused. Also, there are 17 soldiers in this hospital who are alive partly because of calls you made in the last hour. That's not nothing in terms of political weight. I'm not interested in political weight. I know you're not. That's why I'm telling you about it. What? The credential review moved faster than Mara expected, which meant Farker had made phone calls she hadn't tracked to people she didn't have visibility on. And those people had made other calls, and the machinery of emergency authorization, which normally ground slowly, had been applied with the particular urgency of a federal liaison who understood leverage. She was handed paperwork at the 1-hour mark by a hospital administrator she'd never seen before, a small, efficient man named Price, who appeared from the direction of the administrative suite with a clipboard and a slightly shell-shocked expression that suggested his morning had not gone the way he'd planned. Temporary emergency practitioner authorization, he said, holding out the clipboard. Scope limited to assessment, triage, and directive coordination only, does not authorize independent procedure. She signed it without reading it in full, because the scope described was exactly what she'd been doing, and the paperwork was catching up to reality rather than defining it. Price looked at her signature. Ms. Voss, for what it's worth, well, he stopped. You don't need to say it, she said. Right. He took the clipboard back. Right. Okay. She was already moving. Private Dubrow, the one she'd identified in the parking bay, the tension pneumothorax, the one whose breathing had changed when the medic's needle went in, had been moved from the acute bay to a monitored room after his chest tube was placed. He was conscious now, which he hadn't been reliably before. Mara stopped in because the nurse covering his room had flagged a rhythm irregularity that was almost certainly benign and almost certainly worth confirming in person. Dubrow was awake and looked like he was trying to figure out where he was and whether it was worse or better than where he'd been before. "Hey," Mara said. He looked at her. "You were outside in the parking area." "I was." "You were the one who—" He seemed to lose the thread for a moment, not from confusion but from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running on adrenaline and is now watching it drain. "Someone told me you got fired this morning." "That's accurate." He blinked. "And then you came back." "I was already in the parking garage." She pulled the rhythm strip from the printer at the bedside. "The commute was short." He almost smiled. "Is that a joke?" "Kind of." "Are you okay?" he asked, which surprised her enough that she looked up from the strip. "I mean, that's a weird thing to happen to someone. Getting fired and then—" He gestured vaguely at the room around him, at the hospital, at the implied chaos of the last 2 hours. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because he'd asked in a real way that deserved a real answer, "I don't know yet. Ask me later." "Okay," he said, like he intended to hold her to it. She looked at the rhythm strip. Benign, as suspected. She marked the chart and left him to sleep. The thing that nobody talks about in mass casualty events is the specific quality of the drop. Not during is its own thing, forward motion and acute decision-making, and the particular absence of reflection that the body enforces when reflection is a luxury you can't afford. But after. When the acute phase ends and the floor shifts from emergency protocol to monitoring protocol, and the noise drops a register, and you're standing at a counter with a cup of coffee someone handed you that you don't remember accepting, and your hands are steady but your mind starts doing the accounting. It was too busy to do before. Mara was standing at the far end of the nursing station at the 90-minute mark with exactly this quality of stillness when Solon found her. He didn't approach her the way he'd approached her in the parking bay or in the corridor. He came to stand beside her at the counter, which was different, and he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. 18 patients, he said. All of them stable. 17, she said. Mwangi's in surgery. She'll be out in 40 minutes. Pat said the tear was smaller than the imaging suggested. Good outcome expected. Good. A pause. The credential authorization, Solon said. I know. I filed the objection before. He stopped. Restarted. I filed it before I knew what was in the record. Mara turned her head to look at him. He was looking straight ahead, at the middle distance of the nursing station, at nothing in particular. Okay, she said. I'm not saying that as an excuse. I didn't take it as one. He was quiet for another moment. Then, the patient last week, Okafor. What about him? I should have moved faster. She didn't say yes. You should have, because that conversation, in that moment, would have been for her and not for him. And she wasn't in the business of providing herself with satisfactions at someone else's expense. She just said, he's alive. Because of you. Because surgery caught the laceration in time. You get to be part of that. Solon made a sound she couldn't categorize, and not quite agreement, not quite dismissal. Something in between that was probably the closest he could get right now to something more complex than he had language for. He walked away without another word, which was fine. That was enough for one day. Chumped. Farquhar found her 20 minutes later. He'd been on and off his phone since the moment she'd first encountered him in the parking bay, and he had the look of someone who had been managing several conversations simultaneously and had just arrived at the end of the last one. How are the patients? He asked. All stable or in surgery? You could read that in the chart. I'm asking you. She turned to look at him properly. What's in the fax? He looked at her steadily. You know what's in it. I know what I did. I don't know what's in the document. He was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much of this conversation to have out loud. 6 combat deployments, 4 of which involved documented mass casualty events where you functioned as the primary medical decision-maker. 2 commendations that are currently classified. A series of incident reports that your commanding officers wrote in a way that strongly suggested they were trying to make sure whoever read them later understood what you were actually capable of within the constraints of what they were allowed to say. Mara said nothing. There's also a notation, Farquhar continued, from a lieutenant colonel whose name I can't share, written in 2013, that reads, he paused, and she could tell he was quoting from memory. Sergeant Voss does not wait to be told what to do. In a field environment, this is an asset. In an institutional one, it will cause her problems. I hope the institutions she encounters are wise enough to recognize the difference. She looked away. He wasn't wrong, Farquhar said. He wasn't, she agreed. A long pause. What happens now? She asked. For the patients? Continued monitoring, 2 more surgeries likely, transfers to appropriate specialty care within 24 to 48 hours. I mean for me. Farquhar seemed to weigh his words. The termination this morning is going to be reviewed. That's not a promise. That's a structural consequence of what this afternoon has demonstrated. The hospital's legal team will want to look at it. The DoD has a stated interest in the medical management of their personnel, which means they have standing to be involved in that conversation. He paused, and Director Holloway has already been asking different questions than she was asking this morning. What kind of questions? The kind that start with, why didn't we know, and end with, how did this happen? Mara looked at the floor for a moment. That's not enough, she said. Not bitterly, just clearly. No, Farquhar said. It's not. But it's where it starts. He left her with that, and she stood with it, and around her the nursing station kept moving. Quieter now, more ordered, the particular rhythm of a department that had been through something and was still standing. She was still standing. She'd done what she came back to do, without a badge, without authorization, without anyone in this building asking her to. She'd done it because the alternative was standing in a parking garage watching people die while holding a cardboard box. She wasn't proud of it. Pride wasn't the right word for this feeling. It was more like accuracy, the feeling of having been exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was built to do, which was not the same as everything being fine. Everything was not fine. But the people in those beds were alive, and the floor was stable. And somewhere in the administrative suite, there was a 17-page fax that was about to make a set of very specific problems for a set of very specific people. She hadn't asked for any of it. She picked up the next chart. That was when the double doors at the end of the corridor opened, and 2 men in military dress uniform walked in, moving with the deliberate pace of people who are not here for the clinical situation and never were. And behind them, a woman Mara recognized. She recognized her because she'd briefed under her once, in 2012, in a room with no windows, and the woman had said 4 words to her at the end of that briefing that Mara had never repeated to anyone. She was a colonel now. The rank was on her shoulder. She looked across the nursing station, found Mara's face, and walked directly toward her without looking at anyone else in the room. Mara set down the chart. Whatever came next was going to change something, and she didn't know yet if it would change it in her favor or in the direction of something she wasn't prepared for. The colonel stopped in front of her and said, "They pulled your record." "I know," Mara said. "All of it." Mara went still, because there were sections of her record she'd known about, the commendations, the incidents, the deployment logs. And there were sections she hadn't known anyone would ever access again, sections that had been sealed not for administrative convenience, but for reasons that were considerably more serious than that. "How much?" she asked. The colonel's expression didn't change. "Enough." The colonel's name was Reyes. Mara had not known her as a colonel in 2012. She'd known her as a major, and even then, only briefly. A 12-minute debrief in a building at Fort Carson that didn't appear on any base map. At the end of an operation that didn't appear on any official record. Major Reyes had asked 3 questions, listened to Mara's answers without writing anything down, and then said the 4 words that Mara had not repeated. "We'll remember this one." She had not expected to find out what that meant. She was finding out now. "Walk with me," Reyes said. It wasn't a request. It had the same quality as Farquhar's "don't leave the hospital" from 2 hours earlier. Not threatening, not negotiable. Just the tone of someone who moves through a situation with authority they don't need to announce. Mara walked. They went down the corridor away from the nursing station, past the acute bays, toward the consultation rooms at the end of the hall that were used for family conversations and the occasional difficult diagnosis. One of the two men in dress uniform stayed at the corridor entrance. The other followed them in and closed the door. Reyes didn't sit. She stood near the window with her arms at her sides and looked at Mara with the direct, calibrated attention of someone who is assessing rather than judging, which was different enough that Mara noticed the distinction. "The sections that were pulled," Mara said. "How much latitude did Farquhar have?" Farquhar requested the standard service record. What he received was the standard record plus a flag trigger. Reyes paused. "Your file has an automatic flag. Any access query from a federal affiliated entity within a declared emergency context triggers a secondary release to my office." "I didn't know that." "You weren't supposed to." Mara looked at her. "Why?" "Because in 2013 a decision was made that certain personnel represented a category of asset that warranted ongoing situational awareness. You were listed." Reyes said it without apology and without particular warmth, just the clean delivery of a fact that had been true for 11 years without Mara's knowledge. The flag was dormant. Today it activated. The room was small and the light from the window was the flat gray of a November afternoon that hadn't decided whether it was going to rain. Mara stood in the middle of it and processed what she was being told, which was that she had been, in some technical federal sense, watched. Not actively, not intrusively, but filed, categorized, marked as someone worth tracking in the background. "What does that mean right now?" she asked. "It means I'm here, and the men with me are here, and the conversation I'm going to have with your hospital director in approximately 20 minutes is going to be different from the conversation she thought she was going to have today." Reyes looked at her steadily. "It also means I need to know something from you before I have it." "What?" "The sealed portion of your record. There are two incidents, one from 2011, one from 2013, both redacted above my clearance level at the time I last reviewed your file, and now partially released as part of the emergency secondary trigger." She paused. "I've read them. I need to know if there's anything in them that would complicate what I'm about to do on your behalf." The 2011 incident and the 2013 incident. Mara knew exactly what they were. She didn't think about them in the way that people think about things they're ashamed of. She thought about them the way you think about decisions made under specific conditions that no longer exist, accurately, without the option of revision, with the full weight of what they'd cost. "No," she said. "Nothing that would complicate it." Reyes studied her face for a moment. "You answered that fast." "Because I've had 11 years to think about whether I'd answer differently." Another pause. Reyes seemed to reach a decision, not the visible reaching of someone who is uncertain, but the final settling of someone who has already done most of the work and is now completing it. "All right," she said. "Stay available. This is going to move." She left. The man in dress uniform left with her. Mara stood in the consultation room alone for 30 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then she went back to the floor. What she came back to was different from what she'd left. The surface of it was the same. Nurses moving, monitors cycling, the ambient noise of a department in sustained operation. But the texture underneath had shifted, the way a room's temperature changes before you consciously notice it. People were looking at her differently. Not all of them, and not obviously, but she was trained to read rooms, had been trained to read them in contexts where reading a room wrong had consequences that made this one look abstract, and she felt the shift clearly. Private Holt, scalp laceration, the one who'd said Sergeant Voss in the parking bay and cracked the surface of what she'd been hiding, was being discharged from the minor treatment area. He was standing at the counter getting paperwork sorted, and he saw her cross the floor and he straightened, not to attention exactly, but the body's memory of attention. "Ma'am." "Stop that," she said. "Old habit." He didn't stop entirely. "How's everyone doing, Dubrau?" "Dubrau's awake and stable. Mwangi's still in surgery, but the prognosis is good. Asante's being prepped for a procedure, but it's manageable." Holt absorbed this with the controlled relief of someone who has learned not to react visibly to good news because the situation could always reverse. "And you?" "You're the second person to ask me that today. Probably should be more." She looked at him. He meant it plainly, without performance. "Go home, Holt. or wherever they're sending you. You've done what you came here to do. I didn't come here to do anything. We didn't exactly choose this hospital. You said my name in a room full of people who were thinking about me as a liability. That mattered. He shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with being credited for something he'd done by instinct. You saved Decker's life in 2017. The least I could do was say your name. She didn't have a response for that wasn't going to be more than this moment could hold, so she just nodded once and moved on. The next escalation came from inside the hospital, which she should have expected and didn't. At the 2-hour mark, a charge nurse named Tillis found her outside Trauma Bay 2 and pulled her aside with the particular efficiency of someone delivering information they don't have time to package carefully. Solons filed a second objection, Tillis said. Directly to the board this time, not Holloway. He bypassed her. Mara processed that. On what grounds? Same grounds as before, unauthorized practice, liability exposure. But he added something. Tillis hesitated. He's saying the credential authorization that Farker pushed through is invalid because the emergency designation was declared by a federal entity, not by the hospital board, and the hospital board has to ratify any emergency authorization before it's operative. Is he right? About the technical process? Probably, on paper. But that process normally takes days, and nobody's used it in an active emergency because the whole point is... Tillis stopped. It's a procedural argument. It might not hold, but it buys time. Time for what? Time for the board to convene, review the situation, and potentially put a stop to everything you've been doing for the last 2 hours. Retroactively. Mara looked at the floor for a moment. When's the board meeting? Holloway's calling an emergency session. 20 minutes. You're not invited. I know. Solon is. She looked up. Tillis met her eyes. He'll make his case. Holloway will make hers. Farker's been in contact with the board chair directly, but that doesn't mean the votes are there. She paused. I'm telling you because you should know. Not because there's something you can do about it right now. Mara nodded. Is there anything on the floor that needs me right now? Asante's procedure is in 10 minutes. Tamboli is led, but she asked if you'd be available. I'll be there. Tillis nodded once and walked away. Mara stood for a moment with the knowledge of the board meeting sitting in her chest. Not panic, not the hot spike of anger that would have been easier to manage, just the cold, specific weight of a situation that was about to be decided in a room she couldn't enter by people who had not been in the parking bay when Dubrow's breathing changed. She went to Asante. The procedure for Asante was an ultrasound-guided extraction under local anesthetic, not a major surgery but precise work, requiring the kind of stillness from the patient and the kind of sustained focus from the clinical team that made it more demanding than its technical classification suggested. Tamboli was efficient and methodical and didn't need direction. What she'd wanted Mara for, it turned out, was less about the procedure and more about Asante. He was 23 and he'd been holding himself together with the specific rigidity of someone who is managing fear by not acknowledging it. And that rigidity was the problem, because rigid patients move at the wrong moments, and movement during a guided extraction in proximity to the subclavian space was not ideal. Mara positioned herself where Asante could see her face without moving his head, and talked to him through it. Not about the procedure, not about what was happening, but about the kind of nothing conversation that gives a scared person's brain something to do that isn't imagining what the needle is doing. His unit, how long he'd been in, what his plans were when the current contract ended. He had a younger sister in Atlanta studying to be a teacher. He was planning to use his GI Bill for engineering. My brother used his for construction management, Mara said. Is that what he does now? Yeah, in Albuquerque. You close? Close enough that I should call him more. Asante managed something that was almost a normal expression. I never call my sister enough either. Call her tonight, Mara said, when this is done. He kept still for the rest of the procedure. Tamboli removed the fragment cleanly and handed it to the tech with the particular controlled exhale of a physician who has been holding tension in their body and is now releasing it without making a production of it. She looked at Mara across the bay. Something in the look acknowledged something they hadn't said aloud, and then she turned to close the wound, and Mara stepped out. She was in the corridor when Dominique appeared with the expression that meant the board meeting had happened faster than expected. 22 minutes, Dominique said. They're done. That's fast. Farquhar showed them the record, not summaries, the actual documents. He requested to address the board directly, and they let him. Dominique's voice had the flat delivery of someone relaying facts and keeping their own reaction in a separate compartment. Solon made his procedural argument. The board chair asked Holloway for her recommendation. What did she say? Dominique paused. She said, and I'm quoting because Price told me directly, she said, "The procedural question is valid. I'd like to table it for 72 hours and focus on what this hospital needs for the next 6 hours." Mara absorbed this. That's not a vindication. No, it's a pause. It means you keep working. The formal review of the authorization happens later, and Solon's objection is logged but not actioned immediately. Dominique looked at her steadily. It also means Holloway made a choice about which direction she was going to point herself, and she pointed it toward you. For now. For now, Dominique agreed, but that's what you've got. It was enough. Not satisfying. Satisfaction was a different thing, and it lived somewhere further down the road than today, but sufficient to keep moving on. Mara moved. The crisis she hadn't anticipated came at the 2-hour 40-minute mark. It came from Dubrow. He had been stable. His chest tube was patent, his pressure was holding, his rhythm was in normal sinus. The nurse covering his room, a steady, experienced woman named Hartke, had been checking his vitals on the 20-minute protocol, and everything had been within acceptable parameters. And then, in the space of one vital sign cycle, it wasn't. Hartke hit the call button, and Mara was already in the corridor heading toward the nursing station when the overhead went off, and she turned directly for Dubrow's room without waiting for the overhead to finish announcing the room number because she already knew. Dubrow was conscious, which was something. He was also clearly in distress. The particular quality of respiratory distress that had a different character from his presentation in the parking bay, tighter and more central, less the mechanical failure of the pneumothorax, and more the electrical wrongness of a heart that was doing something it wasn't supposed to. She looked at the monitor. His rate was 170 and climbing. The rhythm was not sinus. Dubrow. She put a hand on his arm. Look at me. He looked at her. His eyes were working. What's happening? Your heart's going too fast. We're going to fix it. She turned to Hartke. Get me Tamboli and a crash cart in the corridor outside, not in here yet. She emphasized the not in here yet because a crash cart appearing in your room had a specific psychological effect on a conscious patient, and she was not going to provoke that effect unless it became necessary. Hartke moved. Mara stayed with Dubrow, watching his face and the monitor in alternating glances, tracking the rate, watching for the variables that would tell her which way this was going. Am I dying? Dubrow asked. Not on my watch, she said, and then, can you slow your breathing down? As slow as you can. Take a long breath in and hold it at the top for me. It was a vagal maneuver, and it was low percentage at a rate of 170, but it cost nothing to try, and the act of giving him something to do with his body was as much about his head as his heart. His rate went to 168, then 165. She pushed on his carotid sinus, gentle, precisely located, monitoring the waveform on the screen. Nothing dramatic. Tamboli? She said, because Tamboli had appeared in the doorway. SVT, rate 170, been climbing for approximately 4 minutes. Vagal attempted, minimal response. Tamboli was already moving to the monitor. Adenosine? I'd want a second rhythm strip first. I don't want a cardioverta flutter. Agreed. Tamboli called for the strip, reviewed it in approximately 8 seconds with the speed of someone who has read thousands of them, and said, SVT, adenosine, 6 milligrams IV push. Can somebody tell me what that is? Dubrow said, with the remarkable composure of a person who has probably been in worse situations and has learned that asking questions is a way of maintaining a functional connection to what's happening around you. It's going to make your heart stop very briefly and restart in a normal rhythm, Mara said. A brief silence. Okay, he said. Okay, do it. The nurse pushed the adenosine. There was a moment, 4 seconds, 5, in which Dubrow's expression went through something that she'd seen before in people who had received adenosine, a kind of wrenching, uncomfortable pause that was hard to watch, and then the monitor shifted. Rate dropping, 120, 95, 78, normal sinus. Dubrow exhaled. There it is, Tamboli said quietly. That was terrible, Dubrow said with feeling. Most people say that, Mara said. And they still use it? It works. He looked at the ceiling. Right. A pause. Am I going to be okay? Tamboli answered that one, which was appropriate. She was the attending. It was her call to make. We're going to keep you monitored and look at your electrolytes and cardiac enzymes. SVT in the context of blast injury and chest trauma isn't uncommon. We'll figure out if this was a one-time event or something we need to manage longer term. Dubrow nodded slowly. He looked exhausted in the particular way of someone whose body has just done something involuntary and costly. He looked at Mara. You said not on your watch. I meant it. How long is your watch? She looked at him for a moment, and the question landed in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. Not painfully, but with a kind of weight that had to do with everything that had happened between this morning and this moment. The box on the hood of her car, the deactivated badge, the termination letter in Holloway's folder. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He seemed to accept that. At the 3-hour mark, Reyes found her again. She looked different from how she'd looked in the consultation room. Not in her bearing, which hadn't changed, but in the texture of what she was carrying. She had come from somewhere that had told her something, and whatever it was had landed. Walk with me again, she said. Same corridor, different consultation room. She closed the door and turned to face Mara directly. The review of your sealed record is complete, she said. My office reviewed both incidents this afternoon. And I'm going to be honest with you about what that means, because you deserve that more than you deserve a managed version of it. Reyes's voice didn't change register, but something in it became more deliberate, more considered. The 2011 incident, the review committee's position is that your actions were within defensible operational parameters given the information available to you at the time. The record reflects that the outcome was the best achievable under those conditions. In 2013, Reyes looked at her steadily. The 2013 incident is more complicated. Mara had known that. She had known it for 11 years. The review committee has questions, Reyes continued, that they want addressed formally. Not today, but this isn't an adverse action, but there will be a formal interview, probably within the next 30 days. And I need you to be prepared for the fact that it will cover ground that you haven't had to revisit in a long time. The 2013 incident, Mosul, December. A CCP that took a mortar hit, 3 casualties on her table simultaneously, and a decision that she had made in under 4 seconds that had saved 2 people and could not have saved all 3, and that she had never spoken about publicly because the person she couldn't save had been the most senior officer on site, and the 2 she saved had been enlisted, and that sequence of choices, senior officer, 2 enlisted, 4 seconds, 1 ventilator, had been reviewed and then sealed and then filed somewhere she'd been hoping was permanent. It wasn't permanent. All right, she said. That's all you're going to say about it? What else is there to say right now? Reyes studied her. Most people would want to explain. I made the call I made. Explaining it to you in this hallway doesn't change what happened. She looked at Reyes directly. I can speak to a review committee. I can answer their questions. That's the process, and it's the right process. Another long pause. Okay, Reyes said. Is there anything else in the record? There's a commendation from 2012 that was classified above the level I had access to until today. Reyes reached into her jacket and produced a single sheet, separate from Farquhar's facts. She held it out. I thought you should see it. Mara took it. She read it. It took her a moment to locate herself after reading it, the way you need a moment after something dislocates your sense of the shape of things. The commendation was from an officer whose name she recognized, one she'd worked under briefly and never expected to hear from again. And it described, in the restrained language of official military documentation, an action she'd taken in 2012 that she had not known anyone of that rank had witnessed. They'd seen it. They'd written it down. They'd classified it for reasons she still didn't fully understand, and it had sat in her file for 12 years while she worked 12-hour shifts in a Pennsylvania emergency department and drove home exhausted on the interstate and kept her brother's photo taped to the inside of a locker. Her hands were steady when she handed the page back. "Keep it," Reyes said. "It's yours." She folded it and put it in the pocket of her scrubs. The last thing she expected at the 3-hour 20-minute mark was the 2 critical patients arriving simultaneously. She heard the radio call at the nursing station before she saw them. A secondary transport from the same training site, delayed because the initial transport had prioritized the most acute casualties, and these 2 had been held for field stabilization that had now reached its limit. 2 soldiers. One with burns covering 40% of his body surface area. One with a traumatic brain injury of unclear severity, currently conscious but deteriorating, GCS dropping from the field medic's last assessment. The burns patient went to the ICU team, who had been alerted and were ready. The TBI patient went to Trauma Bay 1. And then Tamboli appeared at Mara's shoulder with an expression that was not alarmed but was very serious. "We have a problem." The problem was this. There was one available ventilator. The burns patient, who had airway involvement from inhalation injury, was going to need it. The TBI patient, whose deteriorating GCS suggested increasing intracranial pressure, might need it within the next 30 minutes if he continued to decline. And if he got to the point of needing it, the window for effective intervention would be narrow enough that they couldn't afford to wait for the burns patient to potentially not need it. "What's the timeline on the burns patient's airway?" Mara asked. Tamboli shook her head tightly. "Burns is calling it immediate. His strador is getting worse. If we don't protect that airway now, we lose the window." "And the TBI?" "Dr. Levon is in there now. Last GCS was 11, and he's been dropping roughly 1 point every 15 minutes. If that rate holds, he hits 8 in 30 minutes. At 8, airway protection becomes necessary. Can we get another ventilator? Price is on it. Nearest available is at St. Benedict. 40-minute transfer time minimum." 40 minutes. TBI patient deteriorating on a 15-minute gradient, burns patient needing the ventilator now. The math was not good. Mara went to Trauma Bay 1. The TBI patient was a staff sergeant named Ortega, 31 years old, and he was still conscious, but the quality of his consciousness was wrong in ways that were visible. Pupils unequal, the left larger than the right, and sluggish, which meant the pressure inside his skull was high enough to be affecting the nerve that controlled the muscle that moved his pupil, which meant they were no longer talking about possible intracranial hypertension. Dr. Levon, a compact, precise neurologist who had been called down from the 4th floor, looked at Mara when she came in. They had not worked together before today, but she'd seen him work in the last 3 hours, and she'd formed a read on him. Thorough, not fast, excellent when he had time, and adequate when he didn't. "What's the latest GCS?" she asked. 10, Levon said, down from 11 20 minutes ago. "So the gradient's faster than we thought." "Yes." She looked at Ortega. He was looking at the ceiling with the focused, slightly desperate attention of someone who is trying very hard to stay present in a situation where their brain is working against them. "Sergeant Ortega," she said. He turned his head toward her, slow but deliberate. "I'm going to be straight with you," she said. "Your brain is under pressure from the injury. We're managing it. You need to stay as still as you can and keep talking to us if you can." "Is it bad?" he said. His speech was slowed, the words slightly effortful. "It's serious. We're on it." He nodded once, carefully. She stepped out with Levon. "Mannitol?" "Already ordered, running now." "If it buys us 20 minutes on the gradient." "It might buy us 30, Levon said. "Maybe." "The ventilator's committed to the burns patient. We have a 40-minute window on a replacement arriving from transfer." Levon was quiet for a moment. "Then we need the mannitol to work." "And if it doesn't?" He looked at her directly. "Then we're making a decision I don't want to make." She knew what decision he meant. Not the ventilator. There were other options, technically, for a patient in extremis who needed airway protection, things you could do in the short term that were not ideal and carried their own risks, but might buy the window they needed. But all of those options required the next 10 minutes to go a specific way, and she didn't know yet which way they were going. She went back into the bay with Ortega and stayed. Tamboli appeared at the bay's curtain 15 minutes later with a look on her face that told Mara the Burns patient's airway was secured and stable before she said a word. Mara felt something loosen in her chest by a fraction. "Burns is tubed and on the vent," Tamboli said. "How's he doing?" Mara checked the monitor. Ortega's GCS had held at 10 for the last 12 minutes. His left pupil was still sluggish, but not worsening. "Holding," she said. "The mannitol is doing something. Transfer ETA from St. Benedict is now 28 minutes. They upgraded the unit they're sending." 28 minutes. And Ortega was holding. She allowed herself nothing. Not relief, not confidence, not anything that wasn't the next 12 minutes of sustained, precise attention. But she let herself look at him, this staff sergeant who was fighting his own skull, who had come through a training exercise that was supposed to be controlled and ended up here. And she thought about the decision she'd made in 2013 in Mosul in 4 seconds. And she thought about how that decision had followed her into this sealed file that was now open. And she thought that the reason she could not have made a different choice in that moment was the same reason she was standing in this bay right now. Because she saw it clearly, the whole picture, all at once. And when you saw it clearly, there was only one answer. There was only ever one answer, and it was the same every time. You did what could be done with what you had, in the time you had, and then you lived with it. Ortega's monitor held steady. Mara kept her eyes on it. Behind her, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the purposeful stride of a nurse or the quick step of a physician responding to a call, but the particular sound of multiple people moving together with the controlled pace of people who had decided something and were arriving to say so. She turned. Holloway was in the corridor. Reyes was beside her. Farker was behind them, and behind Farker was Solon, who looked like a man who had been handed something he didn't know how to hold. And behind Solon was someone Mara hadn't seen before, a man in a civilian suit with a hospital board lanyard around his neck, carrying a folder, who was looking at her with the particular careful expression of someone who has read a document that changed what they understood about a situation and is now recalibrating in real time. Holloway opened her mouth. What she said was, "Mara," and that was when Ortega's monitor alarmed. The alarm was a single sustained tone. Not the rapid beeping of a rhythm change, but the flat, continuous sound of a monitor that had lost its signal, which meant one of two things. The lid had come off, or Ortega had lost consciousness. Mara was already turning before Holloway finished the first syllable of her name. She got to the bedside in 4 steps. Ortega's eyes were closed. His breathing was present but altered, slower, with a quality she recognized as the brain-driven irregularity of someone whose intracranial pressure had crossed a threshold. She pressed her knuckles hard against his sternum. No response. "GCS check," she said to Levon, who was behind her in the doorway. Levon moved to the other side of the bed. Eyes closed, not opening to pain. No verbal response. Motor. Ortega's right hand flexed abnormally to the sternal rub, the left side nothing. 5. Levon said, down from 10 in under 18 minutes. The mannitol had bought them something, but not enough. "I need an airway now," Mara said. Not a question, not directed at anyone specific. The kind of statement that functions as a starting gun. Hartke, who had followed from the corridor, was already pulling the intubation cart. Tamboli appeared at the curtain. Levon called for RSI medications, the rapid sequence drugs that would take Ortega fully under and relax his airway enough to pass the tube. And Mara did the mental math that she always did, the weight-based calculation that she'd done enough times that it lived somewhere below conscious thought. "Etomidate and sucks," she said, "and I need someone to call St. Benedict right now and tell them to move faster." Behind her, in the corridor, she was aware of Holloway and Reyes and the man with the board lanyard, and all of it waiting, the entire weight of the administrative situation suspended while the clinical one resolved itself one way or another. She put it entirely outside her attention. It would be there when she was done. It could wait. Ortega couldn't. The medications went in. His jaw relaxed within 45 seconds. Mara took the laryngoscope, positioned herself, and looked. The view was not clean. It was never clean in the real world. in the way that training simulations with perfect plastic airways and good lighting didn't prepare you for. She could see the cords, but his airway was slightly swollen from the blast exposure, and the angle was tight, and she had one good attempt before she'd need to call for a backup device. She threaded the tube on the first pass. She felt it go through the cords. Hartke attached the bag. The capnography waveform climbed immediately. The yellow-green wave that meant the tube was in the right place and CO2 was being exhaled. Good waveform, Levon said. Secure it, Mara said. She stepped back. Her hands were steady and her heart was doing something louder than usual, but she'd learned a long time ago to perform around that, to let the body run its adrenaline in the background while the front of her mind stayed clean and procedural. Ortega's chest was rising symmetrically. His Zatias, which had been drifting, began to climb. She looked at the monitor for 30 seconds, watching the numbers stabilize into something she could work with, something that meant he had time now. Not unlimited time, not guaranteed time, but the specific resource of more time than he had 4 minutes ago, which was what she'd gone in there to buy him. She turned around. Holloway, Reyes, the board lanyard man, Farker, and Solon were all still in the corridor. Solon was looking at the floor. Nobody spoke for a moment. The kind of moment that has a particular quality when it happens in a hospital corridor. Everyone in it aware that they are standing in the space between an emergency that just resolved and a conversation that has been waiting, and the transition between those two things requires something. A beat, a breath, an acknowledgement that the world has just been reminded what this building is actually for. Holloway was the one who moved first. She stepped back from the bay doorway and gestured toward the consultation room down the hall. Not a request this time either, but the gesture of someone who has made a decision and is enacting it in the only order that makes sense. Mara looked at Levon. He needs continuous monitoring. GCS checks every 5 minutes until the transfer vent arrives. I've got him, Levin said. He meant it. She walked out of the bay. The consultation room felt smaller than it had the 2 previous times she'd been in it. There were more people now. Holloway took the chair nearest the door. Reyes stood near the window as she had before. Farker positioned himself near the wall with his folder. The board lanyard man, whose name was Stroud, introduced himself as the chair of Meridian Cross's Medical Executive Committee in a way that was brief and slightly formal, as if the formality was load-bearing in a situation this unstructured. Solon came in last and stood near the back. Mara stood in the middle of the room and didn't try to take a position. She was too tired for positioning. Stroud opened the folder. I want to be direct with you, Ms. Voss, because I think you've earned that today. He looked up. The board has reviewed the authorization that Mr. Farquhar facilitated, and we've reviewed your service record, the portions that have been made available to us, and we've reviewed the events of this afternoon. How much of the record? She asked. The non-classified summary and the commendations. Colonel Reyes has provided context on the rest. She nodded. The board's position, Stroud continued, is that the credential authorization was procedurally irregular. I want to be honest about that. Dr. Solon's objection identified a real gap in how this was handled. He paused. The board's position is also that the outcomes of this afternoon have made the question of the authorization's procedural validity largely academic. Mara looked at him. What does that mean in practice? It means that 22 soldiers received care in this facility today, 18 of them directly involving clinical decisions you made or directed, and all 22 of them are currently alive. Stroud closed the folder. Procedural irregularities during a declared federal emergency, in service of outcomes of this quality, are not the board's current priority. A pause. The termination this morning is a separate matter, he said. Yes, she said. It is. Holloway spoke. The termination was processed under Standard Performance Review Authority. I made that decision based on an incident report filed by Dr. Solon following your assessment and intervention with patient Okafor last week. She paused, and the pause had weight in it. I am reopening that review. On what grounds? Solon said. It was the first thing he'd said in the room, and it came out flatter than he probably intended. Not aggressive, just the sound of a man who sees where something is going and isn't ready to stop resisting it. Holloway looked at him. On the grounds that the incident report may not have represented a complete picture of the clinical situation. The incident report was accurate. It was accurate about what you observed. It was incomplete about what Mara observed, what she found, and what the outcome was for the patient. Holloway's voice stayed level. Raymond Okafor is in a step-down room on the 3rd floor right now. He was discharged from the ICU 2 days ago. He's going to go home to his family. Solon said nothing. The incident report, Holloway continued, describes a nurse who deviated from established protocol and created conflict in a clinical setting. It doesn't describe a nurse who identified a life-threatening injury that the primary physician missed. She stopped. Let that land. Those are 2 different documents about the same event. The room was quiet enough that Mara could hear the overhead paging system in the corridor. A normal page someone wanted in radiology, the ordinary rhythm of a hospital that was still running underneath all of this. Solon's jaw was tight. He was a man who had built his professional identity around a specific understanding of how clinical hierarchy functioned, and that understanding was being revised in real time in front of people he'd worked with for years. And the revision was being driven not by someone attacking him, but by the plain sequence of events, which was harder to argue with and therefore harder to absorb. I stand by the clinical decision I made on Okafor, he said. I know you do, Holloway said. The review will address that. Garrett. Parker spoke for the first time in the room, and his voice had the particular quality of someone choosing their words with precision. The review is going to happen. The question is whether you participate in it constructively or whether you continue to file objections that the board will be reviewing in the context of today's events. He paused. I'd suggest the first option is in your interest. Solon looked at him. Something passed across his face, not surrender, exactly, but the particular collapse of a man who has been pushing against something and has just realized the thing he's pushing against is not going to move. He looked at Mara. She didn't look away. She didn't give him anything, not contempt, not satisfaction, not the small warmth of mercy that might have made them both feel better in the short term and would have been dishonest. She just looked at him, directly, the way she'd been looking at things clearly her entire adult life. He looked at the floor, us. The formal resolution of the next 90 minutes didn't happen the way things happened in rooms where everyone had agreed on an outcome before walking in. It happened messily, in stages, with interruptions. Levon knocked twice to update on Ortega. The transfer ventilator arrived from St. Benedict at the 30-minute mark. Tamboli sent a message through Hartkey that Mwangi was out of surgery and in recovery with a stable report from the surgical team. Each interruption changed the pressure in the room slightly, in a direction that Mara suspected Stroud and Holloway were aware of. Every update was a data point, and every data point pointed the same way, and the cumulative weight of them was doing something to the conversation that no single argument could have done. Rhea spoke at the 40-minute mark. She had been largely silent since the meeting began, which Mara had noticed. Reyes was not a woman who spoke to fill space, and her silence had had a quality of deliberate waiting, like someone who has timed when their contribution will land most effectively. I want to put something on record, Reyes said, for the committee's formal documentation. Stroud nodded. The Department of Defense has an interest in the medical outcomes for the soldiers treated here today. That interest is ongoing. We will be reviewing those outcomes formally as part of the incident investigation into the training accident. She paused. We will also be documenting the clinical decision-making at this facility during the response period. That documentation will reflect the specific contributions of each individual involved. She looked at Solon once, briefly, in a way that was not a threat and didn't need to be. We'll want that documentation to be accurate, she said. Stroud understood. Holloway understood. Solon understood. In the way that a man understands something when it stops being abstract and becomes a thing with his name attached to it. The meeting ended without a formal resolution on the termination. That would take the review process, and the review process would take days. But it ended with Stroud committing to an expedited timeline and Holloway committing to suspending the termination's effect pending review, which meant that Mara was not, as of this moment, a fired employee. She was an employee in review, which was different And not nothing. She walked out of the consultation room and stood in the corridor for a moment. The floor was quieter than it had been. The acute phase was fully over. The patients were in the positions they needed to be in, and the department had shifted into the particular sustained vigilance of a post-event status, which had its own kind of exhaustion that was different from the exhaustion of the event itself. Dominique was at the nursing station. She looked at Mara when she came out of the consultation room, and Mara made a small gesture, a slight tilt of the head that meant, okay, for now. And Dominique nodded once and went back to her chart. Mara went to wash her hands. It was the thing she always did after a long stretch of clinical work. Not because she needed to at that exact moment, but because the ritual of it, the warm water and the specific 30 seconds of it, was a transition, a way of marking that one thing was over and something else was beginning. She was standing at the sink when Solon came in. He stopped when he saw her. He could have turned around. He didn't. He went to the sink 2 spots down and ran the water and was quiet for a long moment. "The Okafor complaint," he said finally. "I know. I wrote it the morning after. He stopped. "I was angry, not at you specifically, at the situation." He said it with the difficulty of a man who doesn't often try to describe his internal states out loud and is finding the translation harder than he expected. "That's not an excuse." "No," she said. "It's not." "I know." The water ran between them. She turned hers off. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," she said, "because it's not fine. You filed a complaint that cost me my job for 2 hours, or whatever it's been. And it cost me more than that in how this morning felt." She dried her hands. "But you also have good instincts on a lot of things, and you care about your patients, and whatever this review finds, I'm not interested in your career ending. I'm interested in the system that let you file that complaint without anyone asking harder questions about what actually happened with Okafor." She folded the paper towel. "That's what needs to change." He looked at her. Something in his face was different from how it had been at any point today. Not broken, not softened exactly, more like something that had been held in one position for a long time, was finally, slowly, relaxing into its actual shape. "Okay," he said. She left him at the sink. At the 4-hour mark, she found Farquhar near the ER entrance, on what appeared to be the end of another phone call. He clicked off when he saw her. "Ortega?" she asked. "Transfer vents running. Levon called it stable 20 minutes ago. Neurosurgery is being consulted at the receiving facility." He paused. "He's got a chance." "He had a chance 3 hours ago. That's why we tubed him." "Yes." Farquhar looked at her with the careful attention he'd had from the beginning. "The review committee for your 2013 incident will want to schedule within 30 days. I can provide contact information for a JAG attorney if you want representation. I'll think about it." "I'd recommend not thinking too long." "I said I'll think about it." He accepted that. "There's something else." He reached into his jacket, the same jacket that had held the 17-page fax, and produced a card. Plain, minimal, a name and a phone number she didn't recognize. "There's a program, federal, DOD, affiliated, embedded in civilian trauma centers. It places personnel with your background in clinical roles that operate at the intersection of military and civilian emergency medicine. Protocol development, surge response, training." He held out the card. "The position in this region has been open for 8 months. It reports to my office, which means it has protections that your current employment arrangement doesn't." She looked at the card without taking it. "Is this a recruitment?" "It's information. What you do with it is your choice." She took the card. She didn't look at it again. She put it in the same pocket as the commendation from Reyes. "Why did you come here today?" she asked. "Farquhar. Not officially, actually." He was quiet for a moment. "Because when I got the emergency flag from your file, I looked at what it said, and I thought someone should be present who understood what it meant." He paused. "And because I've seen situations like this before, where a person with your kind of record ends up in a civilian institution, and the institution doesn't know what it has, and something gets wasted." He said the last word without drama, just the plain flatness of a man who has seen that particular waste and found it genuinely objectionable. I didn't want that to happen today. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. It was the only thing she said, but she meant it without qualification, which was rarer for her than it should have been, and she knew it. He nodded, pocketed his phone. I'll be in touch about the committee timeline. He left. She was at the nursing station at the 4.5-hour mark, working through the chart documentation that had accumulated during the afternoon. Every assessment, every directive, every clinical call she'd made in the last 4 hours needed to be in the record accurately, and she was not the kind of person who left that to someone else. When Dominique set a cup of coffee next to her without saying anything, Mara looked at it, then at Dominique. From the break room, Dominique said, It's terrible. It's all so hot. Thank you. Don't mention it. Dominique paused. Literally, I have a reputation. Mara almost smiled. She picked up the coffee. She was halfway through the 4th chart when she found it. It was in Solin's original documentation from the Okafor incident, the complaint file that Holloway had referenced, which had been made available to the review committee and which Price had forwarded to the administrative system this afternoon as part of the formal record. She was reviewing it as context for her own documentation, and she was 3 paragraphs in when she stopped. There was a timestamp discrepancy. Small. The kind of thing that could have been an administrative error, a logged time that didn't match the clinical record by 11 minutes, placing Solin's first examination of Okafor 11 minutes earlier than his own documentation stated, which would have meant he had been in the bay before Mara raised her concerns, not after, and had made a clinical assessment he hadn't documented, and had left without acting on it. If the timestamp was accurate, Solin had not simply missed the splenic laceration because Mara hadn't yet raised it. He had been in the room, he had looked, and he had left. She stared at the timestamp. Then she looked at Solin's formal complaint again, at the specific language of it, at the way it described the sequence of events. And she saw, with the clarity of someone who is not looking for something but has found it anyway, that the sequence he'd described had been written to make his first examination disappear. She set down the coffee. She picked up the phone and called Price. Price answered on the second ring, which meant he was still in the building and still at his desk, which meant the administrative end of this day had not yet wound down the way the clinical end was beginning to. I need you to pull something, Mara said. The timestamp log from the Okafor chart. The original EMR entry, not the complaint documentation. The raw system log that records when the chart was accessed, and by whom. A pause. That's in the compliance system. I know where it is. Can you access it? I can request it. It'll take how long? 20 minutes, maybe 15 if the system isn't running slow. Pull it, and don't say anything to anyone until you've sent it to me. Another pause, longer this time, the pause of a man who is doing the math on what he's being asked and what it might mean. Mara, what did you find? I don't know yet. That's why I need the log. She gave him her email and hung up. She sat with the complaint file open in front of her and the coffee going cold beside her, and she did not let herself conclude anything. She had found a discrepancy. A discrepancy was not a conclusion. 11 minutes could be a data entry error, a system clock issue, a transcription mistake made by someone who was charting from memory at the end of a long shift. She had seen all of those things before, and they meant nothing except human fallibility, which was not a crime. But she had also read Solin's complaint 3 times now, and the sequence of events he'd described had a specific shape, and that shape required his first examination of Okafor to have happened after her intervention, not before. And if the timestamp said otherwise, then the shape of his complaint was not an error. It was a construction. She waited. The log came through in 18 minutes. It was a plain text file, the kind of system-generated record that had no formatting and no narrative, just entries, timestamps, user IDs, action codes. She opened it and found the Okafor chart and ran her eyes down the access log. There it was. Solin's user ID, 4:47 p.m., chart access, Bay 2. Duration, 6 minutes. And then her own ID at 5:03 p.m. when she'd first pulled the ultrasound machine. And then Solin's ID again at 5:09 p.m., which matched the timeline he'd documented in his complaint, which matched the sequence he'd described. which was the version of events the hospital had used to justify the termination. His first access at 4:47 was nowhere in his complaint. 16 minutes he'd had. 16 minutes in the chart before she'd ever said a word to him at the nursing station. 16 minutes that had been excised from the official record he'd submitted. She printed the log. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7:22 p.m., which meant the day had been going for longer than she'd been tracking, and she called Holloway's direct line. Holloway's office was on the second floor, which was quieter than the ER floor at any hour, and especially at this one. The building had the particular quality of a hospital in the evening, not empty, never empty, but operating at a lower register, the daytime institutional noise replaced by the more sustained, quieter hum of a place that doesn't close. Holloway was still at her desk. She looked like someone who had been at her desk for 14 hours and was going to be there for another 2, which was probably accurate. Mara put the printed log on the desk without preamble. The timestamp in Solin's complaint doesn't match the system access log. Holloway looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the fax pages in the conference room, with the careful attention of someone who is about to receive information that will require decisions they don't have the energy for but are going to make anyway. She picked it up. She read it. She set it down. His first chart access was 4:47, she said. Yes. And his complaint states his first examination was at 5:09. Yes. Which means... She stopped. She was not a person who finished sentences when the end of the sentence was something she needed to sit with for a moment. It means he was in the chart before I raised any concerns, Mara said. It means the clinical picture was available to him. And it means the complaint he filed described a sequence that wasn't the sequence. Holloway was quiet for a long moment. He could argue he accessed the chart and then left to attend other patients before completing his examination, she said. Not defending him, presenting the defense he would use because that was what a thorough administrator did. He could, Mara said, and the review committee can evaluate that argument against the clinical notes, the nursing record, and whatever he can produce about where he was between 4:47 and 5:09. She paused. But that's a very different conversation than the one this hospital was having this morning. Yes, Holloway said quietly. It is. She picked up her phone and made a call. Mara didn't stay to hear it. She'd given Holloway what she'd found, and what happened next was the process that the process was designed to handle. And she was not the process. She was a nurse who had found a discrepancy in a chart and reported it. That was exactly what she was supposed to do. The formal notification reached Solin at 8:15 p.m. Mara wasn't there when it happened. She was on the ER floor writing her last chart notes of the evening when Dominique appeared at her shoulder with the particular expression she'd worn several times today, the one that meant she knew something she'd decided to share. Solin's been placed on administrative leave, Dominique said. Mara kept writing. Pending review of the complaint documentation, Dominique continued. The compliance office is involved now, also HR. Also, apparently, the hospital's legal team, which means it's moved from an internal HR matter to something the institution is treating as a potential documentation integrity issue. The phrase documentation integrity issue was the hospital's way of saying what it was without saying what it was, which was a physician who had omitted information from an official complaint in a way that materially altered the outcome of a termination decision. How did he take it? Mara asked. Dominique was quiet for a moment. He left without saying anything to anyone. She thought about the man at the sink, the difficulty with which he'd said, "I was angry," the floor he'd looked at when he couldn't hold her gaze. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd known she wouldn't. Triumph was for situations where you'd been playing to win, and she hadn't been playing anything. She'd been working, and the work had turned over a stone, and what was under the stone was what it was. Is he going to be all right? She asked. Dominique looked at her. That's a strange thing to ask, is it? The man filed a falsified complaint that got you fired. I know what he did. She put down her pen. I also know he's been practicing for 15 years and he's probably scared right now. And scared people do things that compound their problems. And I'd rather the outcome of all this be that the system fixes a problem than that one person's career ends. She paused. Both things can be true. Dominique looked at her with an expression that was more complicated than Mara had the bandwidth to interpret right now. "You are a very strange person," she said finally. "I know," Mara said. "I've been told." At 9 p.m., Mara sat in her car in the parking garage and called her brother. The box was still on the hood. She'd moved it to the back seat at some point in the late afternoon. She didn't remember exactly when, and it was there behind her now. Coffee mug and compression socks and photo and pens, the weight of 7 years that wasn't heavy. Eli answered on the third ring with the slightly alert quality of someone who has been waiting for a call they knew was coming. "Hey," he said. "Hey, you okay?" "I don't know yet," she said, which was what she'd said to Dubrow earlier and meant just as much now. "It's been a day. You got fired this morning." "Yeah. And then?" She looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage, at the fluorescent strip lights that buzzed faintly if you listened for them, at the same third floor she'd parked on for 7 years because the stairwell exit was closer to the ER entrance. "And then a lot of other things happened," she said. He was quiet for a moment, waiting, and she appreciated that about him, that he didn't fill silence with guesses. "Are you still fired?" he asked. "No, maybe. The review's still going, but probably not." "Okay." A pause. "Are you going to stay there? At that hospital?" That was the question she hadn't answered yet, even to herself. She turned it over. The card from Farquhar was in her pocket. The commendation from Reyes was in the same pocket, and the cardboard box was in her back seat. And the answer to whether she was going to stay was not a yes or no answer, which she suspected Eli already knew. "I don't know," she said. "That's fine," he said. "You don't have to know tonight." That was the other thing she appreciated about him. "How are the kids?" she asked. "Chaotic. Maya lost her lunchbox again. Second one this month. Tell her I'll get her another one. She's going to think that's an invitation to lose more of them." "Maybe it is. I can afford a lunchbox, Eli." He laughed, the short, genuine laugh that she'd been hearing her whole life, and something in her chest that had been held at a specific tension since the moment Pitts had walked her to the elevator finally, quietly, released. She sat in the car for a few more minutes after she hung up, not thinking about anything specifically, just letting the day exist behind her without trying to organize it yet. Then she got out of the car and went back inside. Dubrow was awake when she stopped by his room at 9:30. He looked considerably better than he had in the parking bay, which was a low bar, but clearing it meant he was sitting up, his color was human, and he was eating something from a tray with the particular determination of someone whose body has decided it is hungry again, which was a good sign. "You're still here," he said, "finishing charts." At 9:30. "Charts don't care what time it is." He put the fork down. "Did they fix things with your job?" "They're working on it." "That means not yet." "That means not yet," she agreed. "But the direction is right." He nodded slowly. "I asked someone about you while you were in the meeting earlier, one of the nurses." He paused. "She said you'd been here 7 years. She said you were the best nurse on the floor, and everyone knew it, and nobody had ever said it to you directly, because that's not how hospitals work." "Which nurse said that?" "She made me promise not to tell." Mara looked at him. She thought it was probably Dominique, who had a reputation to protect. "The thing is," Dubrow said, "I've been in situations where someone was the best person in the room, and everyone knew it and nobody acknowledged it because of how the structure worked. I've been on the wrong side of that, and I've been on the right side of it." He was looking at her with the direct, unguarded attention of a young man who had almost died today and was in the business of saying things plainly because of it. "I just want you to know that from where I was sitting, in the parking lot, when you walked over, I knew, before you touched me. Something about how you moved." She looked at him. "You moved like someone who already knew what to do," he said. She didn't have an answer for that wouldn't have been too much, so she just said, "Get some sleep, Dubrow." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time she let it go. Reyes found her in the corridor at 10 p.m., which was the last thing Mara had expected, because Reyes had the bearing of someone who did not spend her evenings in hospital corridors when the acute situation had been resolved. "I thought you'd be gone," Mara said. I was. I came back. Reyes had changed out of her dress uniform jacket. She was in the same trousers and a plain dark top, which made her look simultaneously more civilian and more formidable, the way people do when they stop performing their authority and just carry it. I heard about the timestamp discrepancy. That moved fast. Farquhar has sources in the administrative suite. She paused. I'm not surprised by what you found. I want you to know that. Mara looked at her. Were you expecting it? I was expecting something. In my experience, when someone reacts to being proved wrong by filing a formal complaint rather than adjusting their assessment, the complaint is doing work that clinical disagreement alone doesn't explain. Reyes said it without emotion, just the observation of someone who has spent enough time watching institutional behavior to have categorized its patterns. He wasn't just protecting his decision. He was protecting something he couldn't afford to examine. His own record. His own image of his record, which is different and usually more dangerous. They stood in the corridor together for a moment, two women who had been in different kinds of difficult rooms today and were now in the same quiet hallway at the end of it. The 2013 review, Mara said. What's the realistic outcome? Reyes considered. Honestly, the committee will review the decision, find it defensible within the constraints you are operating under, and close the file with a notation. The sealed classification on those sections was never about culpability. It was about the political sensitivity of the operation itself. She paused. You made the right call in Mosul, Mara. The committee will confirm that. It will just take 30 days and some uncomfortable questions to get there. Mara absorbed this. I could have saved him, she said. Not as a defense, not as an argument, just the plain statement of what she had lived with for 11 years, put into the open air for maybe the third time in all those years. No, Reyes said. You couldn't. That's what the record shows. I know what the record shows. Then why? Because knowing something and being at peace with it aren't the same thing. She said it plainly, without drama. I know the decision was right. I've known that for 11 years. I still think about his face. Reyes was quiet for a moment. So do I, she said, and the way she said it told Mara that Reyes had her own version of that room, her own 4 seconds, her own face, and that this was not information she shared often, which made the sharing of it significant. They didn't say anything else about it. The position Farquhar mentioned, Reyes said, shifting. The embedded program. I have the card. It's a real offer, not a consolation prize, not a relocation away from a problem. It's a role that needs someone with your specific combination of experience, and it's been open because that combination is not common. She looked at her directly. Think about it seriously. I will. Good. Reyes straightened slightly. Get some sleep. The next few weeks are going to require something from you. She left the way she'd arrived, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who moves through situations rather than around them. The formal review of the termination concluded 11 days later. Mara was reinstated with full back pay for the period of the suspension, which Stroud communicated to her in a letter that was 3 paragraphs long and mostly procedural, with one sentence near the end that was not procedural. The board wishes to acknowledge that the clinical decisions made during the events of November 7th reflected a standard of care and judgment that this institution should be proud to have on its staff. She read that sentence twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in the same drawer where she'd put the commendation from Reyes and the card from Farquhar. Solon's situation took longer and resolved differently. The documentation integrity review found that the timestamp discrepancy was not an administrative error. The compliance office determined that the omission of his 447 chart access was deliberate, supported by his own handwritten notes from that day, recovered from his office during the review, which referenced the Okafor chart at a time consistent with the system log and inconsistent with his complaint. He had written something down on paper that he had then chosen not to include in the digital record. The board voted to remove him from his attending position pending a formal hearing with the state medical board. The hospital's legal team notified their malpractice carrier. HR initiated proceedings to claw back the performance bonus he'd received the previous quarter, which had been tied partly to department metrics that the review now called into question. He didn't fight it. That was the thing Mara heard from Dominique, who heard it from Price, who had been present when Solon was notified of the board's decision. He sat with the letter in his hands and he didn't argue, and he didn't threaten, and he didn't call his attorney. Not in that room, not in that moment. He just sat with it. She didn't know what to do with that, and she decided she didn't need to do anything with it. His reckoning was his own. She'd reported what she found. She'd done it because it was the right thing, and because the system required it, not because she wanted to watch him fall. The difference between those two things mattered to her, even when it was inconvenient to maintain. Well, she called Farker on a Tuesday morning, 16 days after November 7th. She was in her car in the parking garage. The same third floor, the same spot, old habit, and she had the card in her hand, and she made the call before she could organize a reason not to. "I want to know more about the program," she said when he picked up. "I thought you would," he said. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Sound like you already knew." "I did already know. That's not arrogance. I've read your file. People with your profile don't stay in one place when a better-fitting place becomes available." He paused. "The position involves protocol development, surge training, interagency coordination during mass casualty events. You'd be embedded at Meridian Cross as a primary site. You'd also have satellite responsibilities at 2 regional trauma centers." Embedded at Meridian Cross. Is that a problem? She looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage, at the same fluorescent strip she'd been parking under for 7 years. "No," she said, "it's not. The paperwork takes 3 weeks. The salary is significantly above your current rate." He said the number, and she kept her response to herself because he didn't need to know that it was enough to finally fix the dent in the Civic's rear bumper and have money left over. "There's a 30-day onboarding period that will overlap with your 2013 review committee interview." "I know, that's fine." "Any other questions?" She thought for a moment. "The lieutenant colonel who wrote the notation in my file. In 2013, she won't wait to be told what to do. In a field environment, this is an asset. In an institutional one, it will cause her problems. Do you know who that was?" A pause. "I do." "Is he still around?" "He retired in 2019. He's in Tucson, growing tomatoes, last I heard." She almost smiled. "Tell him he was right about both things." "I'll pass it along." She hung up. She sat for a moment longer in the car, in the place she'd parked for 7 years, with the morning coming through the garage entrance at the angle it always came, the specific gray November light of Dunmore, Pennsylvania, that didn't announce itself dramatically. It just settled in. Then she got out of the car and went to work. The thing about that day, November 7th, the box on the hood, Pitts with his eyes on the floor, and a deactivated badge, and the sirens that changed everything, was that Mara never described it as the day she was vindicated. Vindication implied that what happened had been about her, and it hadn't been. It had been about Dubrow's breathing, and Mwangi's stillness in the parking bay, and Ortega's pupils, and Asante's sister in Atlanta who needed to get a phone call that night. It had been about what the work actually was when you stripped away the hierarchy and the paperwork and the particular organizational cowardice of institutions that mistake rank for competence and silence for professionalism. What she'd learned, not on November 7th, but over the years that had accumulated before and after it, was this: the people who get dismissed are not dismissed because they're wrong. They're dismissed because they're inconvenient, because they see things that the people above them would prefer not to have seen, because they say the thing that needs to be said in a room that has quietly agreed not to say it, and that kind of disruption makes everyone uncomfortable, and discomfort in institutions gets managed by removing its source. The institutions that survive are the ones that eventually figure out what they threw away. The ones that don't figure it out don't get a second chance. She'd given Meridian Cross a second chance because the patients needed her to, not because the hospital deserved it. That was a distinction worth keeping clear. Institutions didn't deserve grace. People did. The nurses who'd followed her calls in the parking bay, Dominique who'd appeared with terrible coffee at exactly the right moment, Tamboli who'd trusted her, read on Asante without needing credentials explained to her, Levon who'd stayed with Ortega. Those people doing their jobs in the chaos of that afternoon were what the institution was actually made of, underneath all its organizational chart and its performance reviews and its documentation integrity issues. She thought about that on the mornings she drove to work, past the same stretch of interstate where she used to pull over when she was too tired to see straight. She didn't do that anymore. She was less tired now, which she'd initially attributed to the new role's different hours before she realized it was something else. The particular drain of being in the wrong-shaped space, of spending energy every day suppressing the most useful parts of yourself to fit what the room was willing to tolerate, was gone. She hadn't known how much it cost until it stopped. That was the thing nobody warned you about. Not the moment of being dismissed, not the humiliation of the box and the escort and the deactivated badge, not even the crisis, which was real and brutal and demanded everything. The thing nobody warned you about was how much it cost to make yourself smaller than you were for years on end, and how long it took to notice, and how different it felt when you stopped. She wasn't a hero. She was a nurse who had been a soldier and had made decisions in both roles that she'd had to live with, some cleanly and some not, and who had learned that the difference between competence and recognized competence was often just visibility. Who was in the room, what they were willing to see, whether the institution had enough honesty to acknowledge what was in front of it. She walked through the ER doors every morning now with her badge active and her name on the protocol documentation that was being rolled out to 3 regional facilities and a commendation in the drawer of her desk. And none of that was what she was there for. She was there because in the next 12 hours, someone was going to come through those doors who needed exactly what she knew how to do. That was enough. That had always been enough. She just needed the room to finally be quiet enough to hear it.